In the midwestern state of Ohio lies Columbus, a city home to over 905,000 residents and some of true crime's most notorious mysteries, most notable of which is the bizarre disappearance of med student Brian Shaffer. But it is not one of these more widely known cases we will examine today. Instead, we will be taking a look at one of the city's most haunting unsolved cases involving the callous murder of a new mother. This case was brought to our attention by our Top5s patron, Jessie, who has done invaluable research of her own into the decades-old unsolved case of Ruth Alter. In 1950, Ruth King met and fell in love with Russell Alter, a twice-divorced railroad fireman with a solid reputation. Deputy Sheriff Clyde Murray later described him as having a #1 record with me and called him one of the city's top men. On Christmas Eve that year, the couple tied the knot, and in February of 1951, they moved from Russell's parents' property to their newly purchased house at 350 North Sylvan Avenue in the neighborhood of Hilltop. 2 months later, on April 8th, Ruth, now 32, gave birth to the couple's first child, a son they named Clarence Frederick. For a little over 2 weeks, the couple enjoyed time as a family. They were, by all accounts, enamored with their newborn, but their happiness was shattered on April 25th when Russell returned home one evening to find Ruth dead. On the morning of April 25th, at around 5:30, Russell kissed his new bride goodbye and left the house for a day of work. At the time, the 39-year-old had 2 jobs. His full-time employment was with the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he also had a part-time gig with the special deputies as a motorcycle escort for funerals. Ruth was known to still be alive at 8:35 a.m. when Clyde Murray, reported in newspapers as being in charge of the special deputies, called the couple's home and asked to speak with Russell. Ruth explained that at 5 o'clock that morning, her husband had been called in for a shift with the Pennsylvania Railroad and wouldn't be home until 3 or 3:30 that afternoon. Clyde had called in regards to a funeral taking place later in the day, but he and Ruth said their goodbyes when he realized Russell wasn't available. Ruth's movements after this time are unknown. Russell, meanwhile, finished work at around 3 p.m. and headed over to see his mother, Stella Drugan, and his stepfather, H. The trio caught up with one another and shared a meal before the 39-year-old invited his parents back to his new home. For some time, H. Drugan had been ill, so he hadn't been inside the couple's new house yet, nor had he met their new baby. Russell added that he planned to go to the shops, but said that he needed to speak with his wife first to see what she needed, so the three headed over to North Sylvan Avenue. Back at the couple's property at around 6 p.m., Russell noticed that the door was unlocked. This was unusual, and he'd made sure to lock it when he left that morning, but it wasn't something which immediately alarmed him. He ushered his parents inside and followed afterwards. It was his mother, Stella, who discovered the body in the doorway where the kitchen met the living room. The scene was, by all accounts, a bloodbath. Blood was spattered across the stove, the fridge, the bins, the back door, the kitchen table, the walls, and even on the ceiling. Ruth's end had been a horrifically violent one. She was still wearing her slip dress and dressing gown. Officers who responded to the scene later recalled Stella saying, "Oh my God, she's had a hemorrhage." Ruth had been brutally beaten, almost beyond recognition. Likely, investigators suspected, with a loafer-style shoe which belonged to her husband. He'd left the pair just inside the living room doorway. The shoe was located by officers who noticed that an attempt had been made to clean it, and the heel of it was missing and never located. puncture wounds found on Ruth's body had possibly been made by the nails protruding from the sole of the shoe, where the heel had come off, and the 32-year-old had also suffered a blow across her chest, shoulder to shoulder, about 4 inches wide. Additionally, there were fingernail marks on her neck, suggesting she had been strangled, though her cause of death was listed as a broken neck. A bloody slip located at the scene was believed to have been what was used to try and clean the shoe. Other evidence recovered from the home included a bloodied cloth rag from beneath Ruth's body, and numerous bloodied paper towels from near the body and inside the bathroom. Investigators theorized that the struggle that had taken place had started in the bedroom, noting that there was blood between the pillows and down the side of the bed. A broken lamp was also observed in the room. Fingerprints were collected from the home, although it doesn't appear that these prints were of any use, as they did not lead anywhere in the investigation. Several items were noted to be missing from the home, including $1 which had been lying on a dresser, a Ronson lighter, and a watch worth $185. Thankfully, the couple's baby, Clarence, was discovered safe inside his crib in one of the bedrooms, though he had likely been left unattended for most of the day. Russell felt that he and his parents were in too much of a state of shock to look after the child, so he asked his second ex-wife, Betty Lehman, to temporarily care for Clarence. She and her new husband were good friends with Ruth and Russell, and she was more than happy to take the baby on in their time of tragedy. Very early on in the investigation, officers with Franklin County Sheriff's Office began theorizing. Initially, they suspected that Ruth's murder was some sort of revenge killing. Russell, however, was referred to as a top man who didn't have any enemies. Ruth, meanwhile, was originally from the city of Zanesville, and her father was deceased. She spent 5 years before she met her husband working at the Broad Hague restaurant as a waitress, where couples knew her as quiet and pleasant, noting that she never discussed her personal life. At one point, investigators noted that a former colleague of Russell's had been questioned in connection with the case, but he was released without charge. There was some speculation by law enforcement that the killer had used the nearby train tracks to come and go from the scene, but this idea was eventually dismissed. Authorities then began searching for any strangers seen loitering in the neighborhood around the time of the murder, although they could not be sure when that was. The coroner originally believed the killing to be between 12 and 15 hours before she was found, but that would change when it was discovered she was last seen alive at 5:30 a.m. and was last heard on the phone between 8:35 and 8:45. Investigators suspected she was possibly killed around noon. Shortly after the murder, a sheriff's deputy revealed, "We have a theory about the mysterious stranger, but we're not disclosing it." Upon speaking with neighbors, investigators discovered that 2 witnesses had seen an unknown man knock on their doors and leave before they were able to answer. The first sighting was around 7:45 a.m., while the other was about an hour later, just before 9. One of the witnesses stated that the individual approached the Alter's home afterwards and described the man as being between 5'10" and 6 foot tall, with a brown leather briefcase and a blue-gray suit. However, one neighbor, a man who was out working in his garden between 8 and 12 p.m., noted that he didn't see anyone strange and unrecognizable in the area during this time. Of course, Russell was questioned shortly after Ruth's body was found. He was quizzed by authorities for 9 hours, not including breaks, and was subject to a polygraph test, which he passed. The 39-year-old arrived at work at 6:40 a.m. alongside another colleague, an engineer. The two worked their shift together between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. Russell was described as having an excellent work record, and between his alibi and his response to the polygraph test, he was ruled out as a suspect. Notably, a lot more stock was put into polygraph tests back in 1951 than it is today, where more often than not, the results of these so-called lie detectors are not admissible in court. In total, 6 people were questioned and released on the day of Ruth's murder, including Betty Lehman, Russell's ex-wife. In the following days, they announced that the stranger they were looking for, who had been seen by several eyewitnesses on the morning of April 25th, was likely a salesman. They also noted that they were searching for a late model blue-colored Chevrolet which had been parked across the road from the Alter residence that day. Several previously unknown clues were also discussed by authorities during this time. Firstly, it came to light that strands of brown and grey hair, which had been clutched in Ruth's hand at the time of her death, had been lost when the coroner failed to deem them as important, and an attendant assisting with the post-mortem washed them away. Secondly, though, was that 2 buttons, described as being pearl-covered, were found next to Ruth's body at the scene. They are likely to have come from a woman's coat or a men's sports jacket, with the coroner stating that they were apparently from a woman's clothing. Notably, there were no buttons on the garments Ruth was wearing when she was killed. The reveal of the buttons found at the scene led to some speculation that a woman was responsible for the death, or at least involved in some way. Over the next few weeks, investigators followed several leads. They looked into the backgrounds of 2 brothers who had left bloody clothing in their sister's home. The brothers denied any knowledge of the case and the bloody clothing, which was never found. They also checked out a dress with missing buttons, which had been given to a dry cleaner. Around this time, there were rumors that Ruth had previously testified against a Columbus-based narcotics ring, and her mother-in-law, Stella, was subject to an eerie, threatening phone call where a woman said, quote, "Mrs. Alter, ain't you dead yet? You too will be murdered soon." Though Stella hung up immediately, the person called back. They were never identified. Stella stated she sounded like she was either drunk or trying to disguise her voice. A former girlfriend of Russell's, who had reportedly taken a strong dislike to Ruth and threatened her, was separately investigated, followed by a red-haired youth who'd assaulted a local 57-year-old. But despite all the possible leads and information, the police were unable to find anything solid. In early May, those close to Ruth and Russell were re-interrogated, along with other potential persons of interest, including a 40-year-old waitress who was an ex-girlfriend of Russell. She would later be cleared of involvement after passing a polygraph test. Still, no motive for Ruth's murder surfaced. Authorities then decided to offer a $500 reward for anyone with information leading to an arrest and conviction of Ruth's killer, but the large sum of cash went unclaimed. Several weeks later, a 23-year-old salesman was questioned in connection with the case, with witnesses identifying his car as the one seen parked outside of the Alter home on the morning of the murder. With the identification of the car, investigators told reporters, "We are optimistic there will be evidential proof against this man as the investigation develops during the day." They added that the young man was a former friend of Ruth's and had been questioned twice previously. He came back to the attention of law enforcement when they re-examined his statements and noticed some discrepancies. They claimed he was still changing his story during interviews. Police also noted that they believed the killer was someone known to Ruth because she appeared to have let that person into her home. Authorities revealed there was some circumstantial evidence against the 23-year-old, who was not immediately identified. The evidence included a lack of an alibi, bloodstains discovered on both his brake pedal and the cuffs of the trousers of a blue-grey suit he owned, with both stains confirmed as being human blood, and a business card with his name on it, which was discovered inside the Alter home. The salesman claimed that the blood came from a slaughterhouse he had visited as part of his work and denied being involved in the murder. He failed a polygraph test shortly afterwards. Then, on May 19th, the salesman's identity was revealed. 23-year-old George Phillips was the son of the owner of the Broad Hague restaurant where Ruth had spent 5 years working before her marriage to Russell. Authorities announced, quote, "Results of the lie detector test, plus evidence, warrant filing an affidavit." George was subsequently charged with first-degree murder. George Phillips was in part raised by his grandmother, who had moved to America from Greece when her children, including George's mother, were young. A terrifying accident when he was just 2 years old, which involved him running out into the road after his ball and being struck by a car, saw part of his right arm be amputated. Although this made things difficult for him growing up, George often took advantage of the way his peers would underestimate him. Our patron, Jenny, reached out to one of his childhood friends, who told her he would often play up his handicap to older children at the park and challenge them to games of tennis, where, if he won, they would hand over their money. The older children, surprised by his boldness, would agree to the bet and be easily beaten by George, who walked away with their cash in his pocket. George was described by those who knew him as likable and pleasant. He began attending university after graduating from school, but ultimately dropped out and became employed as a salesman. A local grocery store owner recalled how the last time he saw the 23-year-old, shortly before his arrest, he had been discussing his favorite soup recipes. According to newspapers at the time, George had known Ruth through her work at his father's restaurant for 4 years, and the two had reportedly had a run-in at some point during this time, with investigators stating that, back then, Ruth had slapped the young man for an inappropriate remark he had made to her. George then hit Ruth back, with police quoting him as saying, "I hit her harder than I intended to." Authorities suggested that a similar set of events had led to the mother-of-one's death on April 25th. They theorized that George had come to the house to see the newborn baby and secure a time to discuss taking out an insurance policy for him. Then, at some point during the visit, the 23-year-old hit Ruth, perhaps harder than he meant to, and she'd struck her head on the bed and lost consciousness. When she came to, she ordered George out and followed him into the living room, where she picked up one of her husband's shoes and hit the young man with it. George then lost his temper and retaliated by grabbing the footwear and beating Ruth with it until she fell to the ground. Detective Lieutenant Lester Bauman described George as an unfortunate youth with a violent temper. Upon searching George's home again, which he shared with his grandmother, investigators discovered a pair of shoes that they hadn't previously been able to locate. The shoes had blood on the soles, but it was obvious that an attempt had been made to clean them. Similarly, a briefcase was found that also had traces of blood on it. Authorities observed that the 23-year-old drove a blue 1937 Pontiac. During the initial court hearing, 3 colleagues testified that George was in a work meeting and was later at a restaurant on the morning of the murder. His defense also produced a witness who countered what 2 of the prosecution's witnesses were saying, that an unidentified man matching George's description had come to their doors earlier that day. The defense's witness was that same man we mentioned earlier, who was out working in his garden all morning and saw nobody odd or unfamiliar come or go. George's defense lawyer, Paul Herbert, also questioned Russell Alter during this time, making sure to interrogate him over the state of his marriage and his personal life, even querying the paternity of the couple's son, Clarence. George Phillips was ultimately released on a $50,000 bond due to an obscure Ohio law. 21 of his friends and relatives pledged the $50,000 in cash or property, allowing him to leave jail until his formal trial started. Upon his release, George stated, "It is with the sincerest appreciation and deepest humility that I take this opportunity to express my thanks to my many friends for their confidence in me." In August, the Franklin County Grand Jury indicted George on second-degree murder after hearing testimony from 33 witnesses. If found guilty, he would be sentenced to life behind bars, but could be considered for parole after 10 years. The following month, Ruth's body was exhumed. She had been laid to rest in Rose Hill Cemetery, south of Zanesville, in a plot near her father's. The Franklin County prosecutor, Ralph Bartlett, told reporters no comment when news broke of this development. Newspaper accounts observed that Ruth's face and neck were studied, and photographs were taken of her closed casket. Finally, on October 23rd, George's trial began. Paul Herbert, his lawyer, filed a notice of alibi just days earlier, despite the fact that the prosecution had still not narrowed down Ruth's time of death, stating that it was unknown to the state of Ohio when Herbert pushed for a detailed answer to help him with his client's alibi. During the trial, further circumstantial evidence came to light, including witness testimony that a bloody shirt had been found among George's laundry. The defense, meanwhile, noted that fingernail marks had been found on both sides of Ruth's neck and pointed out that George only had his left hand. It was also at this time that several witnesses for the prosecution began receiving threats via telephone. One woman was told, quote, "Well, you better watch out." Another answered the phone to hear, quote, "You and your husband are on the spot. He had better keep his mouth shut." The witness said the voice was in broken English. 2 other witnesses received threats, but the source of the harassment was never found. Paul Herbert is known to have dismissed the concerns of the prosecution in this matter, stating his belief that the publicity-hungry witnesses had made up the stories. Ruth's case and the trial were highly publicized and eventually gave way to a media circus. George's defense lawyer and the Franklin County prosecutor were known enemies with a lengthy history, and eventually the trial became more of a mudslinging match involving the egos of 2 feuding men, rather than a true attempt to find justice for a horrific tragedy. After weeks of testimony, the jury was not convinced. On November 9th, George Phillips was acquitted of all charges. According to our patron Jenny, following this, George became something of a social pariah. He lost his job, and his reputation remained in tatters. He was never able to go back to the life he once lived, and wound up moving to Los Angeles, California, to start over where nobody knew his name. Russell Alter, the husband Ruth left behind, didn't fare much better. He lost both of his jobs, thanks in no small part to the authorities considering him a suspect early on, and him undergoing arrests and questioning several times throughout the investigation. A 1953 article from the Columbus Evening Dispatch observes that Russell filed a civil lawsuit against George Phillips, charging that the 25-year-old wrongfully, unlawfully, maliciously, and intentionally killed his wife, and seeking $75,000, $900,000 today, in damages for himself and his son. Russell also sued the Franklin County Sheriff, Ralph Paul, for $25,000, claiming he was falsely arrested and noting that he spent 4 days in prison in April 1951, just days after he found his wife murdered. He added that the arrest was done without a warrant and without reasonable or probable cause, noting that it was a humiliating experience and that his reputation never bounced back. Sheriff Paul declined to comment for the article. 5 months after reports emerged about Russell's lawsuits, the Columbus Evening Dispatch announced that the 42-year-old was set to remarry. His 4th wife, Alice Adkins, was a divorced mother of 4 and was acquainted with the couple before Ruth's murder. She was one of the people questioned by police following the discovery of the body. Alice remained married to Russell until he died in 1964. He was 53 years old. Russell and Ruth's son, Clarence Frederick, or Fred as he prefers to be known, recalled Alice as a kind woman who raised him as her own and gave him a happy childhood, all things considered. Meanwhile, his father made sure to keep in regular contact with Ruth's side of the family, and they would attend King family reunions every summer. Our patron Jenny reached out to Fred on Facebook, where she was able to learn a little about his life. It was here that Fred revealed that one day, some years ago, while at work, he received a long-distance call from an older man. The man asked Fred how he was getting on, if he was happy, and if he had led a good life. The call, Fred noted, was brief but pleasant and polite. He didn't get the caller's name. It wasn't until afterwards, when he hung up, that he wondered if the older man was George Phillips, who would have been in his 70s at that point, and was still residing in LA. Nobody else was ever charged in the case of Ruth's murder after George was acquitted. Her case remains unsolved 70 years later. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.